The galaxy had grown comfortable in its certainties. For millennia, the established order had remained unchanged. The Kithara Dominion ruled the core worlds with their advanced biotechnology. The Nexari Confederation controlled the outer rim through superior quantum computing, and the Zeph-Hai Empire maintained order in the mid-systems with their unmatched military discipline. Lesser species filled the gaps: traders, miners, servants, and occasionally, entertainment. Humans were among the latter category. When the first human colony ships had limped into galactic space 3 centuries prior, battered and desperate after their homeworld's ecological collapse, the established powers had barely taken notice. Here was another primitive species, technologically backward, politically fractured, and possessed of the disturbing tendency to expire after a mere century of life. Their short lifespans made them useful for dangerous work where the loss of personnel was acceptable but unsuitable for any position requiring long-term thinking or investment. The Kithara, with their centuries-long lifespans and organic technology that could reshape matter at the molecular level, viewed humans as they might view insects. Briefly interesting, potentially useful, but ultimately insignificant. The Nexari, existing as uploaded consciousness within quantum matrices that granted them effective immortality, saw human biological limitations as quaint evolutionary failures. The Zeph-Hai, warrior philosophers whose meditation practices allowed them to enter combat trances lasting decades, considered human emotional volatility a fatal weakness in any conflict. For 300 years, this assessment appeared correct. Human colonies scattered throughout the galaxy's periphery served as mining outposts, agricultural centers, and research stations tackling problems too dangerous or tedious for the major powers to address directly. Human mercenaries fought in proxy wars, their short lives making them expendable assets. Human scientists worked on projects with timelines measured in decades rather than centuries, producing incremental advances that more long-lived species would eventually refine and perfect. The arrangement suited everyone. Humans gained protection and access to galactic technology in exchange for their labor and lives. The major powers gained cheap, replaceable workers who asked few questions and died before they could accumulate enough knowledge or influence to become problematic. But the galaxy's comfortable certainties were built on a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. The first sign that something had changed came from the Kepler Mining Consortium in the Outer Veil. The reports were initially dismissed as clerical errors. A human mining operation had somehow increased extraction efficiency by 400%, while simultaneously reducing workplace fatalities to 0. When Kithara inspectors arrived to investigate, they found the mining stations operating with technology they didn't recognize. The humans had developed new drilling techniques that seemed to violate known principles of material science. Their extraction processes showed an understanding of quantum mechanics that rivaled Nexari achievements. Most disturbing of all, their safety protocols demonstrated organizational capabilities and long-term planning that exceeded even Zeph-Hai military doctrine. When questioned, the human administrators claimed the innovations had emerged from their continuous improvement protocols, a management philosophy focused on incremental advancement through systematic problem-solving. The Kithara inspectors noted this explanation in their reports and recommended continued monitoring, but took no immediate action. After all, what threat could improved mining techniques possibly represent? The second sign came from the Artemis Agricultural Cooperative in the Middle Systems. Human farmers had developed crop varieties that not only thrived in previously uninhabitable conditions, but actually improved soil quality over time. More remarkably, these innovations appeared to be spreading between human colonies with no official communication or technology transfer agreements. When Nexari economic analysts investigated, they discovered an underground network of human settlements sharing information through encrypted quantum channels that their own systems couldn't penetrate. The humans had somehow developed quantum cryptography that was not only unbreakable by Nexari standards, but actively adapted its encryption methods in real time to counter any attempted intrusion. The humans called it their knowledge-sharing initiative, a collaborative effort to ensure that beneficial discoveries reached all human colonies as quickly as possible. The Nexari analysts filed reports recommending further study, but concluded that agricultural improvements posed no strategic threat to galactic stability. The third sign should have triggered immediate concern, but it was overlooked precisely because it seemed so typically human. Reports began filtering in from across the galaxy, describing human communities that had eliminated poverty, crime, and internal conflict. These reports were initially dismissed as propaganda. Clearly, humans were exaggerating their achievements to gain better treatment from their patrons. When Zeph-Hai sociologists investigated, however, they found something unprecedented in galactic history. Human societies had undergone fundamental transformation. developing social structures that combined individual freedom with collective responsibility in ways that their own warrior philosophy had never achieved. These communities demonstrated resilience, adaptability, and unity of purpose that made HFY military units look disorganized by comparison. The humans explained their transformation through something they called conscious evolution, a deliberate effort to overcome their own limitations through systematic self-improvement. They had identified weaknesses in human nature that had historically led to conflict and suffering, then developed cultural practices, educational methods, and social institutions designed to transcend these limitations. The HFY sociologists were intrigued but not alarmed. Social improvement was admirable, but it hardly represented a threat to established galactic order. If anything, more peaceful human communities would be easier to manage and more productive in their assigned roles. None of the major powers recognized the pattern emerging from these seemingly unrelated developments. Improved technology, enhanced communication, and social transformation were not separate phenomena, but aspects of a coordinated transformation that was occurring across all human settlements simultaneously. The truth became apparent only when the monitoring stations began disappearing. The Outer Rim sensor network had been established millennia ago to track potential threats approaching from intergalactic space. Automated stations scattered throughout the void beyond the galaxy's edge provided early warning of approaching objects, whether natural phenomena or potential invasion forces. The network had operated without significant incidents for so long that most species had forgotten it existed. When stations began going offline, the initial assumption was equipment failure. The harsh conditions of intergalactic space were known to degrade even the most robust technology over time. Maintenance teams were dispatched to repair or replace the failing stations. Those maintenance teams never returned. The disappearances followed a pattern that became apparent only in retrospect. Stations went offline in sequence, creating corridors of blindness in the sensor network. These corridors all pointed toward the same region of intergalactic space, a region that had been empty according to every previous survey. When long-range telescopes were finally directed toward that region, they revealed something that should have been impossible. A massive construction project was underway in the void between galaxies, using materials and techniques that violated every known principle of physics and engineering. The construction was clearly artificial, but its scale dwarfed anything ever attempted by galactic civilization. Structures the size of planets hung in perfect formation around what appeared to be an artificial star. The engineering involved would have required the combined resources of every major power working in concert for millennia, but no such cooperation had occurred. Indeed, the major powers had been so focused on maintaining their comfortable status quo that they had paid little attention to their human subjects over the past several decades. When they began investigating human activities more closely, they discovered that their former servants had vanished. Not fled, vanished. Every human colony, every human settlement, every human individual had simply disappeared over the course of a single galactic standard day. No distress signals, no signs of struggle, no evidence of evacuation. Millions of humans had simply ceased to exist in galactic space. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of human transformation over the previous century. While the major powers had been secure in their certainty of human limitations, humanity had been systematically transcending every assumption about their nature and capabilities. The technological breakthroughs that had seemed like incremental improvements were actually components of a coordinated development program spanning multiple scientific disciplines. Human scientists had not been making random discoveries but following a carefully planned research agenda designed to achieve specific capabilities. The quantum communication networks that had appeared to be simple information-sharing systems were actually components of a distributed consciousness architecture that allowed human communities to function as a single coordinated entity while maintaining individual identity and freedom. The social transformations that had eliminated human conflict and suffering were not merely cultural improvements, but prerequisites for the kind of large-scale cooperation required for projects that spanned centuries and involved entire populations. Most significantly, the humans had solved the fundamental problem that had limited their role in galactic civilization: their short lifespans. Not through life extension technology, as other species had assumed would be necessary, but through a form of consciousness transfer that allowed individual identity and memory to persist across multiple biological bodies while maintaining continuity of experience and purpose. This breakthrough had been achieved not through any single technological advance, but through the integration of biotechnology, quantum mechanics, and consciousness studies in ways that created entirely new categories of scientific understanding. Human researchers had literally transcended the limitations of human intelligence by creating collective cognitive processes that maintained individual identity while enabling group problem-solving at unprecedented scales. The discovery that had made everything else possible was humanity's ultimate insight into the nature of weakness and strength. Where other species had viewed human limitations as fixed characteristics to be worked around or compensated for, humans had recognized them as temporary obstacles to be systematically overcome. The human approach to self-improvement was unlike anything seen in galactic civilization. The Kithara improved themselves through biotechnology, reshaping their bodies to meet environmental challenges. The Nexari transcended physical limitations by uploading their consciousness into quantum matrices. The Zephi developed their potential through meditation and philosophical discipline. But humans had done something more radical. They had consciously chosen to destroy the aspects of human nature that created weakness, limitation, and conflict. Through a combination of genetic modification, consciousness engineering, and cultural evolution, they had systematically eliminated fear, greed, short-sightedness, and the tendency toward destructive competition that had historically defined human civilization. This was not suppression or control of negative traits, but their complete elimination at the neurological, genetic, and cultural levels. The humans who emerged from this transformation were recognizably human in their creativity, curiosity, and emotional depth, but they had transcended the limitations that had made them useful servants rather than potential equals. The process had taken nearly 2 centuries of careful planning and implementation. Each generation of humans had been slightly improved over the previous, with changes introduced gradually enough to avoid detection by their galactic overseers. The humans had understood that any obvious transformation would trigger intervention by the major powers, so they had disguised their evolution as natural development and incremental progress. By the time their true capabilities became apparent, the transformation was complete and irreversible. The humans who had seemed to disappear from galactic space had actually evacuated to their construction project in intergalactic void, taking with them not only every human being, but also detailed intelligence about every major power's capabilities, weaknesses, and strategic assumptions. The structures detected by long-range telescopes were revealed to be components of something called the Fleet of Retribution. The name was not a reference to revenge for past treatment. Human transformation had eliminated the capacity for petty vengeance, but rather a statement of cosmic justice. Humanity had transcended its limitations and emerged as something unprecedented in galactic history, a species that had consciously chosen to become worthy of survival and growth rather than accepting the limitations imposed by nature or circumstance. The fleet itself defied every assumption about the limits of engineering and physics. Individual vessels were larger than many inhabited worlds, powered by artificial stars, and equipped with technologies that seemed to manipulate the fundamental forces of reality. The fleet's capabilities appeared to include faster-than-light travel that didn't depend on known hyperspace mechanics, energy weapons that could destabilize entire solar systems, and defensive systems that could render entire fleets effectively invisible to conventional detection methods. But the fleet's most disturbing capability was its apparent ability to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Sensor readings suggested that the visible structures were only a small portion of a much larger construction that extended into spaces that conventional physics insisted could not exist. The humans had not merely built superior technology, but had discovered principles of reality that allowed them to transcend the limitations of three-dimensional space. When first contact protocols were finally established, the human representatives who agreed to communicate with galactic authorities were unlike anything in the historical record. They appeared to be individual humans, but their responses indicated access to a collective intelligence that spanned the entire fleet while maintaining distinct personalities and perspectives. These representatives explained that humanity's transformation had been motivated not by desire for revenge or conquest, but by a fundamental philosophical principle. Any being or species that accepted weakness as permanent and unchangeable was ultimately choosing extinction. The major powers had assumed that their current capabilities represented the pinnacle of possible development, and had structured galactic civilization to preserve their advantages while preventing potential competitors. For example, this approach had seemed reasonable and stable, but it violated what humans called the evolutionary imperative. In a universe where change was the only constant, any system that attempted to preserve the status quo indefinitely was doomed to stagnation and eventual collapse. The major powers had achieved temporary dominance by transcending their original limitations, but then had stopped growing and developing while working to prevent others from following the same path. Humanity's response had been to prove that conscious evolution could continue indefinitely. They had demonstrated that any limitation could be transcended through sufficient commitment, creativity, and willingness to abandon comfortable assumptions about the nature of reality and identity. The representatives made clear that the fleet of Retribution was not intended as a weapon against galactic civilization, but as a demonstration of what conscious evolution could achieve. However, they also indicated that humanity would no longer accept the subordinate role that had been assigned to them in the galactic order. The ultimatum, when it came, was delivered with the calm certainty that characterized the transformed humans. The major powers had a choice. They could continue their attempts to maintain a static hierarchy based on historical advantages, or they could join humanity in pursuing continued conscious evolution. The first option would inevitably lead to conflict, as other species followed humanity's example and challenged the established order. The second option would require abandoning the comfortable certainties that had defined galactic civilization for millennia. To demonstrate the consequences of the first option, the human representatives provided detailed technical specifications for technologies that would allow any species to duplicate humanity's achievements. These specifications were transmitted simultaneously to every inhabited system in the galaxy, making it impossible for the major powers to suppress the information or maintain their technological advantages through secrecy. The specifications included not only technological blueprints, but also philosophical frameworks, social structures, and consciousness engineering techniques that would allow any species to undergo the kind of transformation that humanity had achieved. The information was presented as a gift to the galaxy, but the implications were clear. The age of static hierarchy was ending whether the major powers chose to participate in the transition or not. The response was immediate and chaotic. Species that had been confined to subordinate roles for millennia suddenly had access to technologies and techniques that could elevate them to equality with their former masters. The careful balance of power that had maintained galactic stability began to collapse as traditional assumptions about technological and cultural limitations proved obsolete. Some species embraced the opportunity for transformation with enthusiasm that surprised even their former rulers. The Veltar, who had served as translators and communication specialists due to their natural linguistic abilities, used consciousness engineering techniques to develop collective intelligence networks that made even Naxari quantum processing seem primitive. The Rith mining castes abandoned their genetically programmed specializations to become master engineers whose construction projects rivaled human achievements. Other species found the prospect of transformation too challenging or threatening to accept. The Kythera attempted to suppress the human specifications within their territory, leading to rebellion by subordinate species who had already begun implementing the techniques. The Nexari tried to incorporate human technologies into their existing quantum matrices, only to discover that conscious evolution could not be achieved through simple technological adoption. It required fundamental changes in identity and purpose that their uploaded consciousnesses found incompatible with their existing nature. The Zeph High proved most adaptable to humanity's challenge. Their warrior philosophy had always emphasized the importance of overcoming limitations through disciplined effort, and they recognized the human approach as an extension of principles they already understood. However, they also realized that their current social structure, based on rigid hierarchies and combat prowess, would need to be completely reconceptualized for an age where any species could transcend physical limitations. Throughout this period of galactic upheaval, the fleet of Retribution maintained its position in the intergalactic void, neither advancing toward galactic space nor retreating from potential conflict. Human representatives remained available for consultation and guidance, but they made clear that each species would need to determine its own approach to the new reality. The transformed humans had achieved something unprecedented. They had transcended the limitations that made them weak without becoming a threat to others. Their power was absolute within their chosen sphere of influence, but they had consciously chosen to use that power to enable others' growth rather than to dominate or exploit. This approach reflected the fundamental insight that had driven human transformation. True strength lay not in the ability to destroy one's enemies, but in the ability to destroy the aspects of oneself that created enemies in the first place. Humanity had eliminated the fears, insecurities, and competitive drives that made conflict inevitable, replacing them with curiosity, empathy, and a commitment to mutual growth that made cooperation not only possible, but natural. The process had not been easy or quick. Eliminating the neural patterns and cultural structures that generated weakness and conflict required abandoning assumptions about human nature that had persisted throughout recorded history. Many humans had initially resisted the changes, fearing that transcending their limitations might mean losing their essential humanity. But the transformed humans retained their creativity, humor, emotional depth, and individual personalities while gaining capabilities that allowed them to address challenges that had seemed insurmountable to their predecessors. They had not become less human but more than human, exemplifying the potential that had always existed within their species, but had been constrained by biological, cultural, and conceptual limitations. The knowledge that enabled this transformation was now available to every species in the galaxy. Some would use it to achieve their own transcendence. Others would reject it as incompatible with their nature or values. And still others would attempt to find middle paths that preserved familiar aspects of their identity, while gaining some of the benefits of conscious evolution. The humans had no preference regarding which approach different species chose. Their demonstration had been motivated not by missionary zeal, but by cosmic necessity. In a universe where entropy was the default state, conscious entities had only two options: evolve or deteriorate. Stagnation was not a stable option over cosmic timescales. The fleet of Retribution stood ready to assist species that chose evolution, and to defend against those that chose to prevent others' growth through force. But the humans had made clear that they would not impose their approach on others. The galaxy would determine its own future through the choices made by its inhabitants. As galactic civilization grappled with these new realities, it became apparent that humanity's greatest achievement was not technological or military, but philosophical. They had solved the fundamental problem that had limited conscious development throughout galactic history, the assumption that identity was fixed and that growth required abandoning essential characteristics of one's nature. The human approach demonstrated that identity could be consciously directed rather than passively accepted, that limitations could be transcended without losing valuable qualities, and that competition could be replaced by cooperation without sacrificing individual achievement or recognition. Most significantly, they had proven that weakness was always a choice. Every limitation that seemed permanent and unchangeable was actually a temporary obstacle that could be overcome through sufficient commitment and creativity. The major powers had achieved their dominance by transcending some limitations while accepting others as permanent. Humanity had chosen to transcend all limitations, creating possibilities that had never before existed in galactic civilization. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has eliminated the vulnerabilities that others could exploit. A species that consciously chooses to transcend its limitations becomes not only unstoppable, but also unthreatening, since its power is directed toward creation and growth rather than dominance and control. The fleet of Retribution represented humanity's graduation from servant species to cosmic teacher. They had not sought to rule the galaxy, but to demonstrate what conscious evolution could achieve when pursued with total commitment and unlimited creativity. Their fleet was not a weapon but a school, not a threat but an opportunity, not an ending but a beginning. The galaxy would never be the same. The comfortable certainties of the past were gone forever, replaced by the terrifying and exhilarating possibility that any being or species could choose to transcend its limitations and achieve capabilities that had previously been unimaginable. Some would rise to meet this challenge, others would fall back into familiar patterns, and still others would find new paths that combined traditional values with expanded capabilities, but none could claim that they had no choice in the matter. Humanity had proven that conscious evolution was possible for any species willing to pay the price: the destruction of everything weak, limited, and comfortable about their current existence. The fleet of Retribution waited in the intergalactic void, neither advancing nor retreating, neither threatening nor promising, but simply existing as proof that the impossible could be achieved by those willing to abandon the limitations that made them comfortable in their weakness. The age of excuse and limitation was over. The age of conscious evolution had begun, and in that beginning, every species in the galaxy faced the same fundamental choice that humanity had faced 3 centuries earlier when their homeworld died and they were forced to venture into an indifferent cosmos. Accept the role that circumstances seemed to dictate, or choose to transcend circumstances through conscious transformation. Humanity had chosen transcendence. The galaxy would now discover what choices its other inhabitants would make, when comfortable certainties were no longer available, and unlimited growth had become possible for any who were willing to pay the price of destroying their weak selves to become something unprecedented in cosmic history. The fleet of Retribution served as both invitation and warning. Evolution or stagnation, growth or decay, conscious transformation or passive acceptance of limitation. The choice belonged to each species, each community, each individual consciousness capable of recognizing that what had always been did not have to define what would always be. In the end, humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy was not their technology or their power, but their example, proof that any being could choose to become worthy of the universe's infinite possibilities by consciously destroying everything about themselves that made them less than they could be. The weak self could be destroyed. The strong self could be consciously created. And those who achieved this transformation could never be destroyed by others because they had eliminated the limitations that made destruction possible. The galaxy watched the fleet of Retribution and finally understood that humanity had not threatened the established order. They had transcended it entirely, rising to a level of existence where the petty competitions and hierarchies that had defined galactic civilization for millennia had become irrelevant historical curiosities. The question was no longer whether humanity could be controlled or contained. The question was whether other species possessed the courage to follow humanity's example and destroy their own weak selves in order to claim their inheritance as conscious beings in an infinite universe. The fleet of Retribution waited for the galaxy's answer. End of document. This document represents the collective understanding of the Galactic Historical Archive regarding the human species transformation and the emergence of the fleet of Retribution. Sources include direct communications with human representatives, technological analysis of human achievements, and sociological studies of the galactic transformation that followed humanity's demonstration of conscious evolution. All species are advised that the technologies and techniques described in this document remain available through the open-source repositories established by human representatives. Implementation is entirely voluntary and at the discretion of individual communities and governing bodies. The fleet of Retribution maintains its position in Sector 07 of the intergalactic void. Communication channels remain open for species seeking guidance in conscious evolution processes.